What is going on, everyone? My name is Aaron, and I run a business called Maniac Metals. Maniac Metals is a small jewelry business that specializes in memorial jewelry. A lot of the times what I'll do is use cremated remains, fur, sand, etc. to make meaningful pieces of jewelry. And today we're going to be making one of those pieces of jewelry on film from start to finish. So let's get right into it. So today we're going to be making a ring out of cremated remains for a customer. It's going to be a small round ring, and these are the materials that we're going to be using. First off, the face of the ring itself is going to be this small glass cabochon. And then to fabricate the ring, we have silver sheet. This is a 26 gauge silver sheet. We have double half round wire. We have some bezel, and we have some 12 gauge twisted wire. So essentially the first step of the process is to get our glass cabochon and our bezel wire, and what we're going to have to do is take this bezel wire and wrap it around the glass to get it to the rough shape. We're really looking more for size at the moment, and we're going to solder this together to make it a perfect circle. So this is how we do that. We grab it, make sure that the end is nice and flat, so we have a nice join when it comes to soldering. And then get my pliers and kind of just scrape it a little bit to make sure that it's nice and even. And so I get the cab and I get the bezel wire, and I kind of just wrap the bezel wire around the cab. And we're not looking for perfection here. Again, we're more so just looking for an estimate. So I use my little burnisher to kind of push it around the edge and get it into a kind of circle. And takes a little bit of finesse to do something like this at first, but after lots and lots of practice, it kind of comes second nature. So as you can see, that's not necessarily a perfect circle, but it's pretty darn close. So what I do to cut it out to shape is get a little fine tip Sharpie, and I mark just about where the ends meet with each other, so that's right about there. And it's not often that I use my shears. I more so reach for the saw most times, but with the bezel wire, because it's so thin, I just use these little shears, and you could see where I marked it right there. So I go ahead and just open them up a little bit, and then I do a little snippy snip, just like that. So as you can see right here, it's no longer a circle, but what I've done is I joined it together, so there's barely any seam left. So what we do now is we grab our little soldering board, and there's a couple different ways to solder bezel together, but this is the way that I like to do it. I kind of lay it with the seam facing down. I'll zoom in there a little bit. The seam is facing down on that bezel, and we're gonna grab our flux and spray a little bit of flux on there. Then I like to take the torch and just burn off some of that flux. That was a little too red. I have the light on so you guys can see better, so it might be a little challenging for me to solder, because I like to solder in the dark, just so I could see what temperature my piece is at. But then we grab our solder strip, and I nip off just a tiny little piece and grab the tweezers. And what I'm gonna do, I lost the little piece of solder. So what I'm gonna do is take my little piece of solder, and I'm gonna place it right on top of that seam. And then I take the torch, and once our piece is up to temperature, I'll actually turn off the light so you can get a better idea of what it looks like. So we're just gonna have that flame dance around a little bit, and our piece is already getting up to temp, and our solder's flowed right about there. Even before then, I left the torch on a little longer than I needed to, just to make sure that it flowed to both ends of the seams. So we can see here that it is all now one piece. So super important detail, after heating up the piece, it goes back to its normal color fairly quickly, but it's still really hot. So after heating the metal, every single time before I touch it, I always give it a little dunk in the water just to make sure that it's cooled down. And at this point, it is safe to handle with my hands, and that is called quenching. So we have our bezel, and it's more of an oval than a circle shape right now. So what we have to do is put it around something that is round to manipulate it into the shape it's supposed to be. And this mandrel is going to be just a little too big, so I like to use this wooden dowel for things when my bezels aren't going to fit on either my big or my little mandrel. And it kind of just, I kind of just twist it on there, honestly. And then if I need to, I'll go at it with my rawhide hammer. And so you see the bezel there, it's on the little dowel. And I kind of just hammer it all around to get it as close to the circle as it possibly can be. And this is the point where it's going to take its shape and its final shape. And then we're going to go ahead and solder it onto the back plate. So I'll manipulate this and I'll show you what it looks like, and we'll move on to the next step. So we have our bezel all soldered and shaped together, and it's relatively the shape of the cabochon, but what we can do to make sure it's going to be a good fit is lay it flat. And then we'll grab our cab. And this goes for any cabs, not just for memorial jewelry. Let's say this was a piece of turquoise, I would do the exact same process. So to check our fit, we'll just place it right in there. And there's a little bit of wiggle room, but that's totally okay because after we set it, it's going to be nice and tight. Right, so next we get our silver sheet, and I just cut it out to shape. That's a pretty quick, simple process. And then we get our little bezel and we place it right on there. And I don't cut it out exactly to shape first because remember, we're going to take that twisted wire and we're going to wrap it around. So there needs to be at least a 2 millimeter gap on each side for that twisted wire to be able to fit. Now moving on, we're going to get our solder ready. So when we first soldered it, we used a hard solder, which has a higher melting temperature. And then after, we have to move on to medium solder, which has a lower melting temperature. So our piece isn't going to fall apart when it goes up to temp because we're moving down from hard to medium and then to easy. So I've marked my medium solder by doing just a little 7 shape there on the end. And for soldering the bezel to the back plate, which is the piece of silver, I like to use just about 4 pieces. And I cut off a little more than I really should, probably about that size. And then I just lay them to the side. So we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4. And then same process as before with the soldering. We're going to need to take our flux and just squirt kind of a liberal amount. And we don't want to put the solder directly on the flux because as it heats up, it boils, and that'll kind of make our solder jump around. So what I like to do instead is get our torch, fire it up, and just melt away that flux before we place our solder. That's just the easier way to do it, or else the solder, as you see, it's boiling there. So that'll cause your little solder chips to kind of jump around. So as you can see, the flux is burning away, and it's still going to help us flow, even though it's not necessarily wet anymore. But we just want to get it so it doesn't boil and make our solder jump around. So we have our chips here, and I kind of treat it like it's 4-sided. I take the little pieces of solder and I just place it on every end of the piece itself. So we do 1, 2, 3, and 4. And it doesn't need to be perfect. It's all gonna flow. That's why I use pieces bigger than I really need to, especially because it's not gonna show since we're soldering and placing the solder itself on the inside of the bezel. It's not gonna show on the outside of the piece. So we have our solder placed, as you can see there, and we're gonna go ahead and fire up the torch. and just evenly heat the piece and get it all up to temperature. Both the bezel and the back plate need to reach the temperature for solder so it conjoins and brings both pieces together, which shouldn't take too terribly long because these are very tiny, thin pieces of metal. And any second now, you should see those pieces of solder that we placed down start to flow. There it goes, and after, I kind of just concentrate the flame to make sure it's flowed completely. And there you go. This piece is now joined together. So after soldering, you can see that it's a really ugly color. It's got all this nasty gunk on it. So we have what the jewelers call a pickle pot right there, which is essentially, I'm pretty sure it's called sulfuric acid. It's some type of acid. But what it does is it essentially takes this and it removes all the impurities, all the discoloration, and makes it nice and clean so we can see what we're working with, but it also cleans the metal and allows a nice surface for the next piece of solder to be able to flow. So just dump it in there and let it do its thing, and we'll come right back. All right, so as you guys can see, we took it out of the pickle pot and it's removed some of those impurities and imperfections from bringing it to such a high temperature. So the next step in the process is going to be to grab our twisted wire. This piece has already been annealed and brought up to temperature, so it's going to be nice and easy for us to move around. So what I like to do with this is to make sure it's completely flat on both sides. I grab a tiny little file and I kind of just file away to make sure that we have nice ends that meet together so they make a nice clean solder joint. So you can just see me filing away here and it's nice and flat now. So we have our bezel soldered to our back plate, we have our twisted wire, and what I like to do with this process, lots of different silversmiths and jewelers do it in different ways, but the way that I do it and that makes most sense to me is I simply just wrap it around. So I like to grab my pliers and I wrap it just about to the shape of the circle, and you can kind of see there, it's about the shape of a circle, right? Not too bad. So now we have to saw this and solder it together. So grabbing our saw, and just where these ends meet right here, we're gonna saw right on that joint and see how it fits with our bezel and our back plate. And we can make minor adjustments as we go along. I like to leave myself a little room to play with, so I don't saw just at the joint. I give myself just a little bit of room so I can make small adjustments, and that broke through pretty easily. So now we can check and see how it fits on our piece itself. Just to show a little test fit on the piece, it is pretty much good. We've got a little bit of gap between the bezel and the wire itself, but I'll show you what we do with that in a later process. I add some patina to give it some contrast, which looks really nice in the end. So now what we're going to have to do, we make sure that these joints are lined up nice and evenly, and I just do that with some pliers, and I kind of squeeze and bend them together and make sure that it's nice and good, and it looks good there. You don't see much of a joint, it looks pretty even. And same soldering process as before. What we do now is place it down on our soldering board and add just a little bit of flux. I don't find myself needing to burn away the flux with this. The solder tends to stay in its place for this process, and if it doesn't, I hardly have any issues with it flowing where it's supposed to flow. So our joint is right here, right where my tweezers are poking, so I just place that little piece of solder right there, right on top of it. Again, there's other ways that people do it, but this is the way that I do it, just by placing that solder right on top. And grab our torch. As you can see, it's getting up to temp pretty quickly. Give it a little more flame. It's about to melt just right now. There it goes right down into the joint, and it is officially soldered. So we got it nice and soldered together. So the next step for me to make it a nice perfect round circle is to place it on the ring mandrel and pretty much beat it to death as far as it'll go to make it nice and round. So that's what we'll do. We have our rawhide hammer and we have our twisted wire on the mandrel. It took a little bit of manipulation to get it on there, but now we just hammer it into a nice circle. So as we can see here, it's a nice circle, but it is no longer completely flat. So what I like to do is I get my steel bench block and I place it down right on there, and I just hammer it a couple times on each side to make it nice and flat. So due to the nature of this wire and it being braided, it's got little ridges on it, and we want it to sit just flat against that back plate so there's no gaps that the solder won't be able to fill. So what I do to flatten this out perfectly is I grab one of my files and I just kind of work away at it using the light from my lamp to see where it needs to be filed more. So we just do this until it's completely flat. Kind of just moving around, looking at the light, and you can see here, like here it's not filed completely, so I'm gonna have to hit this spot a couple more times. Just being sure not to focus on one spot for very long to get it as nice and uniform as possible. Which can be tricky to do, but after doing this, we're going to grab a piece of sandpaper and run this along on the piece of sandpaper to make sure it's nice and uniform and even, but this file takes away material a lot quicker than sandpaper does, so this is just the first step of that. But that's as good as it's going to get with the file. So now we're going to take our sandpaper. Once upon a time, this probably was about 80 grit, but I've used it so much that it's not anymore. So we place it down on the sandpaper, and then we kind of just rub it around to get it nice and uniform. And now we need to put these two together. So guess what we got to do? Same process before, we got to solder them. So we place that on our soldering board, and then we just place the little twisted wire border around it. And it's looking pretty good there. I just make sure it's nice and even and that the gaps between them are kind of consistent all the way through. So the end process ends up looking really neat. So what I like to do is I grab my flux and I just use it liberally all around the piece. And for this, I like to use pretty big pieces of solder because it's a lot of surface area that we're covering. So I use medium solder. I don't really go down to easy. I just kind of exercise some caution with my flame. But I take quite large chunks, maybe 5 millimeters wide, and I like to do 4 of them. Realistically, the better thing to do would probably to take smaller pieces of solder and place them all around, but 4 seems to work for me. So we're firing up the torch and we're gonna boil away some of that flux so it's not jumping around so much when we place the solder down. As you can see there, it's starting to foam a bit. And it'll even lift up a little bit as it boils and go back down. When it does that, I know it's safe for me to place my solder. So we'll zoom in a little bit so you can see better what's going on. So we have these particularly or rather large pieces of solder that, same thing when I was soldering the bezel to the back plate, I kind of just place it on all 4 corners, just as best as I possibly can. So we got 1 in that corner, and we'll place 1 down in this corner if it allows me to. Sometimes this likes to jump around a little bit during this process, but we can always fix it after. That's the good thing about making jewelry, is that stuff is pretty easy to fix unless your piece melts. There's really no need to ever start over because what was once soldered can also be unsoldered. So we got them in all 4 corners. I'm gonna turn off my light because we're bringing up the piece to temp. Firing up the torch, you can see I got solder in all 4 corners, and I gotta be careful with this flame because the solder does like to dance around. Like you can see this piece here, it got a little jumpy on me, so I'll just push it back home a little bit. Doesn't seem to want to go, but that's okay. It's still gonna flow and it's gonna connect all the way. So we just bring the piece up to temp. It's gonna be about 1500 degrees, I believe, for this medium solder to melt. And just making small circles around the piece to get it to flow nice and evenly. We don't want to heat any one particular piece of metal up first too much because the solder will immediately jump to that piece of metal, and we want it to connect the braided wire to the back plate. We don't want it to just jump to the wire itself. So it's important to bring it up all to the same temperature at the same time, which is why I dance my flame around so much. And I rely a lot on residual heat to accomplish this. You can kind of see I'm just heating around it on the soldering board, which kind of makes the heat from the solder board heat up the piece of silver. Once it gets to that nice red, I can kind of focus it a little bit more. And as you can see here, the solder is just starting to flow. It's flowed all the way, so I turn up the flame and I just dance it around to make sure it's hit all the pieces I need to hit. So that'll probably be good. We're gonna throw this in the pickle pot, come back to it in a couple minutes. So we have our piece all together here. It's nice and soldered. So now we have to cut it out. There's some residual back plate, and it looks nice and good. The braided wire didn't protrude off the sides or anything, which is perfect. So now we just have to grab our saw and cut around the back plate. So we have it cut out as much as it possibly can be, but you can see it's not a perfect circle there. So we're gonna grab our file and kind of just work our way around to make it into a nice circle, just by doing little movements like this. After it's at the shape I want it to be at, I like to smooth down the edges a little bit. I use my flex shaft with a piece of 220 grit sandpaper and kind of just work my way around. Next step in the process is going to be making the ring shank itself. So for my shank, I like to use this double half round wire. Half round because it saves on material and it is flat on the inside, which means that it's not going to wiggle around on your finger too much. If, of course, you size your finger properly. So there are charts or there are equations that people use to find out the length that you need to cut your metal to. But I just use a chart that's online. So this particular ring is going to be a size 6.5. So I actually cut it out to a size 5. So that's because I leave it open a little bit, which you'll see later, but that's to keep it from wiggling around on the finger a little bit. So we have our measurement on this caliper and we mark the metal where we need to cut it, and then we cut it out to size. So you probably can't see that there, but there's a little mark on the metal where I'm going to need a saw. All right, so we have our shank here and we have to bend it around into the shape of a ring. So to do this part, there are different ways to do it. Again, this is my way. And what I do is I kind of just bend it around the mandrel and slide it down. And I like to work it a little bit with my hammer as it goes down. And it's gonna be a 6.5, but it's gonna be open a little bit. which keeps it from wiggling around on the finger, and I think it looks a little cleaner when it's open because it sits down on the shank nice and flat. Whereas if it's round all the way, you kind of have to file down on the shank to give it a nice surface to rest on. So I think this looks better in my personal opinion. So I like to size it up just about a quarter size because when we go to solder it and file it flat, it does tend to shrink a little bit. But because it's round all the way through, it's not going to stand up straight. So I get this handy dandy little ring clamp and I clamp the ring in it. And I file a little flat spot so it just stands up nice and straight on top of our ring. The ring clamp is awesome. It's one of my favorite tools. It's just so helpful. So what we do, we kind of place it in our bench peg and we file away a little spot to make it nice and flat so it can stand just right on top of our piece for us. Alright, so you can see there we have a nice little flat spot, and now it's time to solder the shank right onto the face of the ring. The face of our ring upside down, and we have our shank, and because we filed it flat, it's able to sit just right on top of that. And I just like to eyeball it to make sure I'm soldering it on nice and straight. Again, if it doesn't end up coming out straight, we can always unsolder it and do it again, but it's always best to just check twice and solder once. So I kind of look at it from all angles, and it looks pretty straight, actually, right about where it is. So we're going to be placing 2 pieces of solder here on either side of the shank. So same process as before. Flux, burn some of it off. And then we get 2 pieces, again using the medium solder. And we take them, and I just place them on either end of the ring, right where it meets the back plate. All right, turn off our light, fire up our torch, and wait for it to join together. And we'll dunk it. And just like that, we got it all nice in one piece. So this is absolutely filthy. So we'll throw it in the pickle pot and come back to it. So after the pickle pot, our ring is a little cleaner. So now it's time to clean it up a little bit. We got some sharp edges on the inside where the ring meets the back plate. So I grab a piece of sandpaper and I just shave that down a bit. So as we can see, we sanded it down a bit. You can see the lines from the sandpaper, which make it nice and easy to just slip on and off our fingers without scratching us. So the next step of the process is just to kind of clean it up a little bit. So I use these radial sunburst discs, and these are by Dedico, and I put them on my Dremel flex shaft and just clean it up and make it nice and pretty. And then the next step from there is going to be polishing and setting. So we're going to use these, and we're just going to move on to a couple different grits to get it nice and clean and uniform and ready to polish and set. So we got our pre-polishing done and our piece is cleaned up nice and beautifully. Now what we're going to be doing is adding that patina in the gaps between the twisted wire and the bezel, like I was telling you guys before. So the patina agent that I like to use is called Jack's Silver Blackener. I actually lost the cap to the bottle, so I have it conveniently in this mason jar, but pretty much it is a sulfide that pretty much is a sulfide that quickens the oxidation process. So I take a little paintbrush and dip it in there, and as you can see, it just really quickly turns wherever I brush it to into black, which gives us a super nice contrast in between that bezel and that braided wire. Now the excess black is going to be buffed off in the next step of the process. I just like to make sure that I thoroughly coat it, and I get the inside as well, because sometimes you can see through the ashes, and I think the black gives it a really nice contrast. Instead of a muted, dull silver tone, just gives it a little bit of pizzazz, a little bit of oomph. So it's about as much as we'll do. We'll dip it in water because these are toxic chemicals, and then we're going to move on to the finishing, polishing, and setting process. So the first part of the polishing process, we're going to use this compound called Tripoli, and it's pretty much just a pretty high grit buffing agent. And this is going to remove any surface scratches before moving on to the final polish. So I do have a polishing machine, but I like to start with the inside and the back plate on the Dremel. So we just add a little bit of that compound to the mop, take our piece, just get the inside of that ring nice and polished. This isn't really a process where you have to be delicate, especially with big pieces like this. So now at this point, the inside of our ring is polished, and I'm going to move on to the big polishing machine. I have one wheel over here that's for Tripoli, and one wheel over here that is for our polishing compound. So I'm just going to work all around and make this ring nice and pretty. So for the sake of the video, I went ahead and I did the final polish on the ring, so it is nice and shiny now, and it is time to set it. So to hold my rings while I'm setting, I have this nifty little ball vise, which essentially is kind of like a ring clamp that you could turn and twist in all different types of directions, and just gives you a nice area to work on where you can turn your piece around and look at it from different angles. So we're just going to go ahead and fix that ring in there, tighten it up nice and tight. And with all of my pieces, especially when I'm using cremated remains, I like to lay down a paper towel like this just in case anything falls, because it often does, and I always scoop it up and send it back. So here are the remains that we're going to be working with. I'm not sure if this is human ash or animal ash. It could be a cat, a human, a dog. I'm actually not entirely sure. This customer didn't let me know, which is no big deal because it's all the same thing. So the best way that I found to do it, so I'm not handling it directly with my fingers, is I take just a little scoop of the ash, and probably a little less than that, and I kind of just try to dump it in there. And as you can see, it does overflow just a little bit, and I bang it to get it nice and even. And it's okay that it overflows because it'll all get caught and sent back to the customer on the paper towel. But we just try to get it nice and even. Probably could use just another little smidge of it just to fill it up as much as we possibly can and make it look nice and uniform. And you can see the bezel's a little contorted there, so grab the pliers and kind of stretch it out just a little bit so the cab will sit nicely in there. So our ash is in all nice and good. So with our ash in there real nicely, we take our cab and we just put it right in there. And sometimes it takes a little bit of manipulation, which is totally okay, but it looks like it's in there nice and evenly. Make sure to close up this bag so nothing goes flying on us. And I like to get the end to this little toothbrush. It's nice and soft, and just to make sure the cab is in there nice and straight, give it a couple little bangs just to make sure it's nice and even. And then I take this little pusher tool that is used for setting, and at first what I do is I take it and I kind of just push the bezel gently over the cab to make sure it's nice and snug. We're not looking for perfection quite yet on this step, but we're just looking to secure it so we can make it nice and uniform and even after. So I kind of just move it around, and it's as secure as it possibly can be at the moment. So we take the same tool and we take our hammer and we kind of just hammer over the edges like so to push it nice and evenly over the cab. It's actually this bezel wire that's holding it into place. So now that it's set in place, the ring is pretty much done. The last step that I like to do, just to do a final little cleanup, is to get this really, really high grit brush. That's not going to scratch it up. It's just going to remove any inconsistencies and imperfections that were caused by the hammering or the setting process, just to give it a quick little cleanup. So now guys, we got a completed ring, so I'll go outside and show you guys what it looks like. All right, everyone, that's going to conclude the video for today. If you guys made it this far and you enjoyed it, go ahead and drop a subscribe, leave me a comment, let me know what you think of this type of work. If you want a memorial ring for yourself, the link to my website will be down in the description below. And if you'd like to get in contact with me, the best way to do so would be through Instagram DM, which will also be linked in the website below. This was really fun to make, so if you guys want to see more process videos of what it looks like to make memorial jewelry day to day, let me know, and I'd like to do more. So with that being said, thank you everybody, and we'll see you later.